Thank you everyone for coming to this session. I think it's an afternoon session, so people are a bit tired. I was expecting a few more, but quality over quantity. So let's start. Here we have a panel, queer identities in Iran and in diaspora, basically. And we have two great researchers in the field here. So we have Dr. Zeynab Peyghambarzadeh. They have a PhD in sociology of gender, and they are also a lecturer here at Iran Academia. And their paper will be titled The Construction of Narratives of Sexual Orientation in Persian-speaking Communities in the Context of Seeking Asylum in Turkey. They'll focus on interactions and practices that shape these narratives. And they'll be our first speaker. And after that, we have Dr. Mehran Rezaei, Power, Knowledge, and Phenomenal Self, examining a non-Foucauldian approach in studying Iranian queer identities in exile. And they'll focus on these queer identities and offer an alternative framework to analyze them. All right, so let's start with Dr. Peyghambarzadeh, please.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. As our moderator said, I'm going to talk about the construction of narratives of sexual orientation in Persian-speaking communities in the context of seeking asylum in Turkey. In recent years, a diverse range of resources about Iranian gay, lesbian, and trans individuals, both in Persian and English, as well as academic and non-academic contexts, have been published. However, the dominant non-mononormative narratives of sexual orientation in these resources reduce the diverse spectrum of sexual orientation to the dichotomy of heterosexuality versus homosexuality. In addition to that, since asylum processes have played a central role in shaping the Persian-speaking LGBT communities in the post-revolutionary Iran, I argue that the dominant mononormative asylum narratives can shape not only the way that Iranian asylum seekers, but also all Persian-speaking in general tell their sexual stories. However, analysis of asylum cases in different countries shows that by asylum seekers claims are by far fewer than lesbian and gay ones. Some studies suggest that other asylum seekers, as well as activists and lawyers, may encourage by asylum seekers to perform gayness in the asylum processes to increase their chances of being recognized as refugees. This paper is based on my PhD study as the first substantial empirical study on bisexuality in Iran, and also the first substantial empirical research on bi-asylum studies in any country. With an interactive narrative analytical approach based on semi-structured interviews with Iranian asylum seekers and activists in Turkey, as well as analysis of Persian social media debate, I explain how a homonormative argument had been used to justify homosexuality at the expense of stigmatizing bisexuality in advocating for acceptance of homosexuality in the three contexts of global North country and Iran, as well as in the asylum processes. The result of my study show how the central role of asylum in the Iranian LGBT communities impact the dominant binary narratives, not only in the context of waiting in Turkey, but also in the pre-asylum contexts in Iran and post-asylum contexts in the resettlement countries. In Iran, in a context where same-sex sexual conduct cannot legally be discussed, and only a heteronormative binary narrative of transness is tolerated, diasporic LGBTQ communities have played an important role. During the past few decades, a considerable amount of information about SOGI in Iran, SOGI in the Iranian communities have been produced and promoted by activists and individuals who either have been through asylum processes or have been working with asylum seekers. The dominant binary narratives of inauthenticity in the asylum processes have become central in understanding of SOGI in the Persian-speaking communities. I focus on the concept of hamjinsbaz or inauthentic pseudo-homosexual. As previous studies have demonstrated, hamjinsbaz is a key concept in understanding same-sex sexual conduct in Persian-speaking communities. Hamjinsbaz or same-sex player refers to someone who has same-sex relationship for lust or pleasure, in contrast to hamjinsgara, whose relationship is based on sexual orientation. Using hamjinsgara as a positive concept and a translation for homosexual was suggested in 1991 in an article in the first Persian gay and lesbian magazine, Human. The concept of hamjinsbaz is often applied to question three different groups who are involved in same-sex sexual conduct and considered promiscuous. First, non-monosexual individuals who are attracted to more than one gender, and as a result, their same sexual desire is considered a choice. Second, the one who are not looking for long-term romantic relationship with their same-sex partner, and finally, the one who seek parallel sexual or romantic relationship. In the same way, non-monosexual individuals have been labeled pseudo-homosexual in English-speaking communities. Pseudo-homosexuality has been discussed in relationship to engaging in the same-sex sexual act as a crime or mental health problem in the military and male sex work since early 20th century in the global north countries. In the 1960s, it was common among sexologists to distinguish homosexuality and pseudo-homosexuality. In later years, psychologists referred these differences as contrasts between inverted and the pervert. Many of these psychologists used to advocate for the legal and social recognition of the right of true homosexuals while defending the punishment of pseudo-homosexuals. This homonormative approach to sexuality is not limited to pathologizing psychological approach. While this critique of romantic love and monogamy was common in the feminist and LGBTQ movement in 1960s and 1970s, after the 1980s, a new love romantic became common in the global north countries in the campaigns advocating for the intimate right of same-sex couples. In contrast to the previous radical queer approach, this new approach is not sex positive. This new and morally conservative approach is based on the dichotomy of good homosexual and dangerous queer. The Iranian LGBTQ movement has been inspired by this assimilationist approach. Similarly, my analysis of the debate of Persian Twitter and my data about pre-asylum life of Iranian SOGI-based asylum seekers shows how Iranian gay and lesbian individuals try to be gatekeepers of community and protect it from non-monosexual individuals by focusing on the desire for monogamous romantic long-term relationship and does not threaten the nuclear family's acceptance of social norm. Similar to the Iranian modernists in the early 20th century who used to think that men are attracted to other men because of gender segregation in Iran, many heterosexual and even some lesbian and gay Twitter users claim that Iranian teenagers fall in love with their same-sex classmates because Iranian schools are gender segregated. While some gay and lesbian Twitter users accept non-monosexual individuals as an opportunity to find a partner, some other gay and lesbian users reject them and label them as hamjinsbaz. I recognize a vicious cycle of by erasure in my data. In the same way, previous studies on sexual orientation-based asylum, as well as analysis of my data on asylum process in Turkey, shows that homonormativity and mononormativity are common in the asylum process as well. As a result, some case officers, activists, aid providers, and asylum seekers also apply the same logic to protect the applicants who are considered as true and deserving gay and lesbian ones from applicants who are considered the fake and undeserving ones. I identified by invisibility and by negativity in 4 Persian-speaking contexts, including offline contexts of pre-asylum life in Iran, seeking asylum in Turkey, waiting in Turkey for the resettlement in global north countries, and the online contexts that connect Persian-speaking communities in all these 3 offline contexts beyond the borders. By invisibility and by negativity, both in the Persian-speaking communities and the asylum system, reproduce binary narratives of instability, inauthenticity, unbelonging, and as a result, undeservingness, which reproduce by invisibility and by negativity and form a vicious cycle of by erasure. Following Yoshino, I argue by individuals are constantly erased in cyberspaces and in offline spaces in Iran, as well as in the asylum process on 2 levels. At the class level, as an entire category, when sexual orientation is discussed in the binary of heterosexual and gay, and at the individual level, when their sexual orientation is questioned. At the epistemological level, the stories that we as Persian speakers consciously and unconsciously choose to talk about our sexual orientation are constructed by the dominant narratives. These narratives are constructed under the impact of our intersections with other in any specific context, resulting in epistemic harm. For instance, it has often taken a few years for the Iranian participants to be able to find information about non-monosexuality because one of their main sources of information has been popular English-speaking media and social media content that erase bisexuality. Following different bias scholars, this research shows the impact of by erasure on epistemic injustice in the process of self-recognition and the rejection in the communities and the asylum process. My data demonstrate different examples of epistemic microaggressions in the online debates and the offline interactions in the various stages of asylum process. Previous studies about by individuals in the other countries shows how this can result in the poorer mental health of by individuals compared with the monosexual ones. Iranian LGBT asylum seekers are not always silent victims of dominant narratives of heteronormativity, homonormativity, and racism, who cannot find information to understand their fluid sexuality and have no word to tell their stories with unconsciously internalized by negativity. For example, one of the participants' selective strategy as a non-binary bi plus asylum seekers to use different terminology to explain their story to different audiences shows sometimes asylum seekers are creative and robust agents who can find other survival methods despite those oppressive systems. While on some occasions they may feel pressure to perform according to acceptance norms of UNHCR, aid agencies, NGOs, and informal communities, in other circumstances, they may feel safe enough to stop performing and tell stories that they believe are closer to their experiences. The results of my interviews also show how the global and Iranian Bi movement had provided spaces for the non-monosexual Persian speakers in the online and offline spaces to find a name for their personal experiences and sexual attraction, connected with collective experiences and engaged in political action by telling their stories in various occasions, for example, in different stages of asylum, on cyberspaces, and in activist media such as Radio Rangin Kaman. Following a linkage methodology, unlike most of the previous studies that only focus on Iranian LGBT communities' life in Iran or their life after seeking asylum or migration, this research had a holistic approach. Depending on where and how researchers recruit their participants, the previous studies reached a certain conclusion about the degree of agency of Iranian lesbian, gay, and trans individuals. I argue that in the same way that Najmabadi shows how some heterosexual trans individuals in Iran distinguish themselves from gay and lesbian individuals by saying that we are not same-sex players, and blame them for being stigmatized by society, Iranian gay and lesbian individuals distinguish themselves by individuals by similarly labeling them as hamjinsbaz with the hope of being accepted by society. Competition over scarce resources in the asylum process makes this distinction even more apparent. In both contexts of living in Iran and asylum, these two mononormative dominant group of heterosexual, binary, trans, and gay and lesbian individuals define who can be considered authentic and deserving to be protected. The exclusion of bi individuals play a more important role in the context of asylum, where proving gayness can result in access to resources. I conclude that the central role of asylum in these discussions around sexual orientation in the Persian-speaking communities, as well as in the influence of English-speaking media and social media contents, has resulted in the binary approaches to sexual orientation and the creation of dichotomy of hamjinsgara and the real homosexual and hamjinsbaz or pseudo-homosexual as the key concept in the understanding of sexual orientation in the Persian language. I argue that what is common in all these three homonormative arguments in the global north countries, Iran, and asylum process is morally questioning non-homosexual individuals to legitimize homosexuality as immutable and consequently desirable.
Thank you very much, Zeynab, for your very interesting and multifaceted presentation and the discussion of LGBT asylum seekers in Turkey. So next we're going to move to Mehran, Dr. Mehran Rezaei. He has a PhD in philosophy and he's a postdoc researcher at the University of Sussex, so my university. There you go. Please, you have the stage.
So thank you very much for introduction. Thank you very much for coming. Because respect the time frame that we have got, I'm just reading the paper I've written about this topic. In this presentation, I suggest an alternative theoretical framework to complement Foucauldian perspectives, aiming to provide a nuanced understanding of the identity and self-formation of queer Iranians. This framework seeks to explore how these individuals navigate their identification within the peculiar context of Iran, where identity is strategically and fluidly constructed and presented. I came upon this idea. I started a project with a team of scholars from the University of Sussex, with many scholars from them, actually, and you can see the names. And I have conducted this project within 2 years, and it has been done recently. I just finished the field book. In this research, we have got 57 participants, 9 key-workers, and 48 individual participants. And the main topics, the overarching theme that has been raised during this fieldwork was that how people regard their identity in a fluid way. I mean, they didn't have several of these participants. They didn't have any kind of essentialist kind of approach in identifying themselves. And this fluidity was one of the overarching themes in this research. And I invite you to watch an excerpt, a part of a documentary I made for this project. I produced it as one of the creative outcomes of this project, highlighting the sense of fluidity by one of the participants speaking about what fluidity means for her. Argavan is speaking about fluidity, making a comparison between nature and identification.
After all those journeys, I decided it's time for me to heal myself and give myself to the nature. I came to British Columbia for its mind-blowing nature, and I dedicated all my time spending with the ocean, with the mountain, with the forest. The nature was the most influential factor in my perception about myself. When you walk in the nature, you are walking in a combination of life and death. Life is growing from everywhere, and at the same time, so many other parts of the nature are dying. And this combination of those paradoxical elements gives you the inspiration every single moment that change is the way to go. Change is the way to go, because nothing is going to stay permanent. And even the most lively things, even the greenest and the most alive elements that you see can turn into a ruin in a matter of few days. So, and you are walking in a fine line between these two gray areas. Witnessing all those changes in my own perception of myself got me to the point that nothing is fixed, nothing is permanent. Even the identity can change through time. Your definition of who you are may change through time. At this point, sometimes I think I don't even need to label myself as in any kind of category, because I have no idea how I may view myself in the years to come and in the future. This fluidity of identity is, I think, the main constant that is always permanent. The fluidity, I think, is the permanent factor, not a fixation of what you thought.
Exemplified by Argavan and reflected by the other participants in this research, demonstrates their rejection of the fixed identity that scientific and legal discourses usually impose on people. This fluid approach is a worldview that facilitates strategic behavior among queer individuals as they navigate and resist the rigidity of institutions, whether in Iran or in exile. Through this fluidity, identity is expressed through conduct and performance, rather than conforming to the notion of an essential, unchanged identity or self. This observation that I mentioned about fluidity and a strategic self is not a very novel idea. You can see a similar idea by Afsane Najmabadi in her groundbreaking book, Professing Self. Najmabadi explored the emergence of transsexuality discourse in Iran. And Najmabadi fieldwork revealed at least two key insights. I would like to highlight them in this slide. First one is that the state-sponsored program in Iran do not perfectly follow the Foucauldian model of obsessive surveillance as Najmabadi expected, because Najmabadi is a kind of Foucauldian scholar. And second is that she observed that transgender individuals' gender expression is deeply intertwined with everyday practices such as clothing choices, naming conventions, and modes of communications, which manifest in the conduct and behavior. This suggests that self-formation in Iran is more closely related to external conduct and behavior than to deep self-reflection, as might be expected in the Foucauldian model. While these findings provide valuable insight into the peculiarities of the Iranian context, a key methodological and theoretical question arises. How can we explain these findings within the Foucauldian framework? I propose that there is an inconsistency when attempting to reconcile the Foucauldian concept of the power-knowledge relationship and sexuality and these findings in the Iranian context. In the remainder of the presentation, I will review critically what to what extent the Foucauldian model doesn't work in the context of Iran. One of the main concepts by Foucault is panopticon. This is a picture of Jeremy Bentham's ideal prison structure known as the panopticon, designed to ensure that every inmate is constantly visible to the security guards. Because of the architecture of the prison, everybody was visible to the security guard. Foucault appropriated this model to illustrate how modern societies operate similarly. Just as the panopticon guarantees constant surveillance, a confessing society, in the Foucauldian terms, incites us to discourse, produce knowledge that reveals our desire. Institutions such as medical services, psychological services, education, and registration offices, they all request this knowledge on a daily basis from us. We have to confess every day to these institutions. Within the panopticon-like framework, this knowledge contributes to shaping our subjectivity as science proliferates categories that obsessively scrutinize people's sexuality, and individuals internalize these categories as their fixed identities. The core of this panopticon system is ensuring that citizens are always ready to confess, and that is the core of the Foucauldian framework, I believe. But comparatively, the absence of the power-knowledge relationship becomes evident when examining non-confessionary or even anti-confessionary traditions such as Islamic theology. To illustrate this argument, I will focus on three concepts from the theory of sin in Islam, that is sin, penitence, and confession. Islamic theology differs significantly from Christian theology, lacking the notion of sinful flesh, or rejecting the concept of original sin. Without concept of sinful flesh or innate sin, only personal deeds matter. And responsibility of individuals this is all about this responsibility of individuals, not the kind of nature of sin that is embodied in human being. Nothing is inherently evil, I would say. Each soul is accountable only for its own actions, according to Quran, reflecting an individualistic account of sin. Consequently, by repentance, believers are not supposed to uncover hidden intentions, but rather focus on individual accountability. Penitence is carried out privately without the need for public confession. And confession. In Islamic theology, there is a strong prohibition against any confession in public. There are several hadiths which prove that. In one of the hadiths, Muhammad advocate the sinners that if you conceal your sin in private and repent in private, that is, you might be forgiven. But if you verbalize, if you confess to sin, there would be harsh punishment as a result. This hadith regarding sin, confession, and repentance highlight the Islamic approach to truth-telling. In this context, there exists a perilous gap between private and public action, actually, in Islam. And this gap will be bridged only by confessing, only by saying what you have done, only by verbalizing. Once a confession, witness testimony, or public statement, or any kind of verbalization lead to an inevitable punishment in the legal system accordingly. So I would say that if we consider the Foucauldian model as a totality, as a seamless totality in which every part, every corner of the society is visible for the institutions and the apparatus of truth-telling, in the Iranian context, I would say that at least theoretically, there is a porous architecture where there is some shapes and gaps, some still spaces that people can exercise. So accordingly, in the Islamic context, specifically in the context of Iran, we can see that there is not that sort of seamless totality, but we can arguably say that there is a sort of porous architecture. But the dominant regime of truth I have described stands in contrast to what Foucault refers as a confessing society. However, in the actual context of Iran, two external forces have been fused with this legal and theological foundation. The first one is civil society activism, and the second one is, astonishingly, the governmental initiatives concerning population management planning, nationwide planning, like family planning or gender-confirming surgeries, this kind of governmental programs. Activists in Iran promote truth-telling about sex and encourage coming out, leading to the proliferation of sexual identities. At the same time, governmental initiatives seek personal information through programs such as family planning and gender-confirming surgeries. This creates an assemblage, I would say, assemblage of paradoxical tendencies. For example, in the case of gender-confirming surgeries, the government simultaneously reinforces patriarchal norms while engaging the modern desires to collect knowledge about personal desires. That was expected in the Foucauldian model. Despite this hybrid system, Iran remains a non-confessing society as long as the legal framework, which is pivotal in any regime of truth, maintains a significant gap between private and public spaces. In contrast to the Foucauldian model of the regime of truth, Iran's governmental efforts have not succeeded in compelling such confession, allowing people to navigate their identity and lifestyle in a porous system of observation. So what I have said so far, I've been talking about the general context of truth-telling, but what about self and role of self in this context? The Foucauldian perspective on confessing society emphasizes how self-construction is shaped and scientific discourses that delve deeply into the truth of sex. Unlike ancient erotographies like Kama Sutra, Kukashastra, this kind of texts which Foucault referred to them as ars erotica, they actually focus on enhancing sexual pleasure, as Foucault believed. But modern sexual sciences, what Foucault called scientia sexualis, in the late 19th century, developed an array of categories fixing identities within these labels. Individuals are taught to self-monitor, shaping their identities according to these scientific classifications since then. In the Iranian context, however, as I said, there is not such a confessing context, and people may have found some porous area to exercise their stealthy freedom, actually. But, as I said, there is assemblage at the end of the day. And this assemblage, integrated into a traditional non-confessing context, has led to a diverse and uneven perspective on identity, enabling individuals to strategically negotiate their life according to the requirements of their surroundings. And I would like to share some of the quotes from the research I mentioned earlier, Negotiating Queer Identities Following Forced Migration, to explain more about the essence of the strategic self among the participants. In this research project I have conducted, the participants illustrate this idea on different occasions. For example, Saeed, who identified himself as a gay man, said, and I quote, "My life was divided into two parts. One of them was my ordinary life. I was going to work, and then I went to my gay life to communicate with my LGBT friends." End quote. And Peyghambarzadeh, who identified herself as a transgender, tailors her self-presentation to suit the situation, presenting one identity to her family and other to her close friends, as she said in these quotes. However, in order to secure governmental support and entitlements and to meet their families' demands, individuals may feel compelled to accept the administered identification. For example, Shaya, who identified herself as a trans woman, said that, and I quote, "The mere fact that I had found a term that I could describe myself with, even if it was a disease, was a ray of hope for me. To feel like I too am someone and I too have a name. Prior to this, it felt like because I was different from everyone else, nature would omit me." These are the examples when people are trying to exercise their own agency. Sometimes they don't have any agency, actually, like Shaya. But the interesting thing is that after migration, there is still some barriers for them, and they still try to perform self-identification with a strategic approach. For example, one of the participants called Xian, it is an anonymous name, exemplified these challenges. He fluidly defined himself as between trans woman and gay man. But there isn't a problem for him to resettle in a country like Canada. And polarized policies of the Canadian government forced him to commit to an identity he is still uncertain about. He said, and I quote, "I said too, I'm a trans. I had to. And the caseworker that worked with me only worked with women and trans people. I don't feel guilty about it because the law was wrong." End quote. In a less rigid system that is compatible with such ambiguity, Xian might not have felt the need to identify himself within these categories. However, because he doesn't subscribe to this polarization, he adeptly navigates different identities within the bureaucratic maze of confessing society. These life histories illustrate how participants navigate in interaction with international entities that impose fixed identifications on queer individuals. Participants express discomfort with this rigidity, leading to new forms of self-identification when free from administrative constraints in the resettlement countries. When there is not any constraints from the international institution, they feel more comfortable to re-identify themselves in a more fluid way. And this figure is quite telling. When they resettle in a country like Canada and the UK, they feel more comfortable to re-identify themselves as non-binary, and while it was not possible to identify themselves as non-binary when they were in Turkey talking with the UNHCR. These findings highlight the concept of negotiating identities when individuals strategically navigate and present their identities in responses to environmental constraints. Against these constraints, queer individuals often seek refuge in two types of still-free spaces in their home country, Iran, which function as gaps within a porous system, as I said. The first of this is virtual spaces. As you see, majority of the people who identify themselves as a queer person under any categories, internet was the primary sources for them. And you can imagine that how influencing is this virtual space for them. In addition to that, there are some underground collective called Life in Iran. It is Life, but they use the term Life in Farsi as well. And Life is kind of coded spaces when they are communicating together and they support each other. And Life is sort of underground community in Iran as well. That is also a sort of still-free spaces for exercising their freedom. So, as a conclusion, the porous architecture of a non-confessing society like Iran does not focus on what Foucault called the inner truths of behavior, the inner truth of sex and sexuality, but it focuses more on behavior and conduct. Therefore, it is a favorable ground for self-presentation as a strategic performance. In such a context, the self becomes a phenomenal entity. It is understood and observed through the phenomenal side of self, like names, makeup style, social communication methods, gesture, expression, posture, and whatever we can call it, practices of self. Najmabadi extends this idea with her concept of the self in conduct, as Najmabadi used in her book, particularly in the context of queer identities in Iran. However, fully understanding the regime of truth in the Iranian context is essential to grasp this phenomenality. Instead of merely applying Foucault's methodology to explain this contingency, I propose adopting a theoretical framework to the specificities of the Iranian context. In this non-confessing setting, individuals can craft fluid presentation in spaces not under surveillance, tailoring their expressions to meet the demands of different situations. This process is what we can refer to as negotiating queer identities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mehran. Very complicated ideas, very simply presented. Thanks. So I'll start with Zeynab. When I was listening to your work, and of course I had a little bit of a background about it, one of the questions that came to my mind was the particular reception of the cultural products you mentioned at the end that, was part of the influence on these, shaping the narratives of these asylum seekers in Turkey. And I was wondering, I assume, because you went over a lack of time, you had to go over it quickly. So my first question is, how were these non-monosexual identities represented in these cultural products? Was it relatively heteronormative, the representation? And if that is the case, the people who engage with these products, your interviewees, how do they receive these products? Do they accept the arguments or the discourse that's put forward by the product, or do they reject it, or is it somewhere in between? So that's what I particularly wanted to ask you.
What was interesting for me was that my participants were very critical of the Persian resources. They did not trust them, even when they were not good at understanding English resources. They tried to use Google Translate to have access to English resources. They try to have access to movies with Persian subtitle. They always tried to use English resources because they trust them more. They believe that anything that is in English is trustworthy only because it's in English. But even when they watched English movies, they were critical of those movies. For example, they were trying to watch movies that were winner of Cannes festivals and movies like that. They knew that Hollywood movies are kind of stereotypical, and they were aware of different kind of stereotypes in those movies. They were able to analyze them because despite what a lot of researchers may assume, a lot of asylum seekers are educated, a lot of them are activists themselves, a lot of them produce content themselves, and they are capable of critical analysis of data, even the ones that are quite young, even the ones that didn't have access to formal education. They are capable of critically analyzing resources, it was very interesting for me how they had access to resources at the same time that other teenagers and young people in the other part of the world had access to the same resources, even when they were not from rich families, even when they were not from big cities, they could still go to CafeNet and ask someone to download movies for them when they didn't have access to high-speed internet. They could find resources by chance when they were not looking for it, just when they were watching satellite. So it was not that they were like actively looking for content about Soji. They could watch a random TV series and find content about Soji issue and then get curious about it and then start searching further. That's the reason that they the first time that they found those resources were in English, because for Persian resources, you need to actively look for them and know where to look for them. It's not that you can just find them in everyday life. Mm-hmm. But a lot of those English resources are everywhere in pop culture, and you may just find them by chance. And then they would trust those Persian resources if they match with the standard of those English resources. Mm-hmm. That was not the other way around. And I think that's important because there is this assumption that activists in global South countries are changing the culture of their home countries. Mm-hmm. And they are blamed for that. I think we don't have that much of power. Mm-hmm. Even if we want, we cannot do that. I think globalization is the main reason behind all of those changes. And the reason that people in the global South are thinking differently is a result of a universal LGBT movement that has resulted in changing pop culture.
All right, thank you. Very interesting. So basically, the products are more available and accessible readily in English, and essentially the people who access them also see further legitimacy in them than they see in the Persian material, but nevertheless they still are able to criticize and, you know, have their own narration of it. That's what I understood. And thank you. That was a very interesting elaboration. Please, yes.
It may be some naive questions. I apologize if so. If I understood you correctly, I think you said when people are applying for asylum, they're often forced into kind of creating defining their identity in a much more narrow way, essentially because of the box, you know, essentially it's a box-ticking bureaucratic exercise, if that's a fair way of saying it. When they come through that process, and obviously you talked about when trans individual, when they come through that process, do they then feel compelled to remain in that identity in terms of identification publicly, or do they feel empowered to return to a much more fluid identity after? If I've understood your narrative, your argument correctly. Two follow-up questions on that. If all of that's true, does that then have any implications? Do they fear, let's assume individuals return to a much more fluid identity? does that have any implications with their relationship with the receiving state? Because obviously they've said, I'm in this country because of A, and actually I'm no longer identifying as A. Sorry, this is all rather black and white version of it all. And I think there's something quite interesting, isn't it? You were talking, I really found the whole thing about conventionality and the Iranian Muslim approach about fluid identities, public and private space. I found that really interesting. And so obviously that jars when they move into the new receiving community as well, does it? Is that does that make sense? That final question. In one sense, they've come from an Iranian Muslim culturalized position where identity is much more private, and as you said, you're much more quiet about your quote unquote sins. Whereas you move into this Western sort of maybe Foucauldian, I've not done Foucault for a very long time, Foucauldian culture where identity is much more public and much more defined. That's the least. I'm more interested in their relationship with the state and whether they remain in a single identity. But the second one, if that makes sense, please answer.
Yeah, actually, I talked about the same matter when I was talking about one of the quotes from Xi'an. The participants were talking about how difficult it was when I was trying to identify myself in the Canadian welfare system, and it was not possible to identify myself as a gay man because there was not any any social benefit for me. And at the same time, because I was not, Xi'an told me that there was not any sharp distinction for me to distinguish myself from the trans side of myself as well. But I could not define myself as a trans woman. And in the case of Xi'an, it was clear cut, kind of lack of knowledge in the system to understand this fluidity. And Xi'an wasn't exemplified this case because, and there are many cases like this I face with in this project like Xi'an. And actually they have to strategically define themselves, as I said before. And there is not any sense of lack of honesty or integration for them because they don't believe in this dichotomy sometimes. I believe that the system is failed because they don't understand us. And because of that, there is no any sense of, as I said, lack of honesty for them. And that's why I choose the term strategic self. That means that they are, and also fluidity, because when you believe that there is not an essentialistic approach in identify yourself, if you believe that there is a spectrum of identification, sometimes you are not just located in one single spot in this spectrum. In that case, you feel that this fluidity justify why sometimes I am trans, sometimes I'm not, but the system doesn't have this definition, of course. And in terms of the relation between state and identity, well, the thing is that in those questions are related to each other. Do I understand it correctly? In the countries like the UK, for example, if you have read the act related to refugees, there are a specific term for people who are claim asylum in the UK, and that paragraph says that there shouldn't be any kind of changing in their own stories. If somebody define himself or herself or themselves as something under some category in one part of the time, and then change this idea through time, that is a sign of lack of honesty and credibility in their stories. And it's one of the problematic for the states, actually. They don't have this, they don't understand this ambiguity of identification.
First of all, I'd like to thank both speakers for sharing your research and your thoughts on these very, very important and interesting topics. My question is for Zeynab. I just wanted to see, I was curious in your research, did you find any variations between different genders of bisexual people, or because you just said bi people as a whole, but I wanted to see if there's variations on their own, depending on what their own gender identification is, on their experience and their narratives.
Well, generally speaking, usually bi women are more visible. And in my research also, it was easier to find bi women. It can be also because people see me as a bi woman, although I do not identify as a woman. This was the first empirical research about bi asylum seekers, because it's really hard to find by asylum seekers who want to talk to researchers, because of course they don't want to talk about their bisexuality. But also, there are differences between bi people who are married and don't have any chance of hiding their bisexuality, and also people who can hide it easier, but also a lot of bi people also may identify as non-binary, but they also may hide it as well. They are also trans people who may hide their bisexuality as well, who can be also with, who may have binary or non-binary identifications. And also they can be accepted in the community or they can be rejected by the community. Generally speaking, bi people are rejected by lesbian community, gay community, and trans community. I cannot see any difference when it comes to that. Bi women are the most visible one, and this is what is common everywhere. It's not specific to the asylum process.
Thank you very much, Zeynab. I'm going to ask a question now from Mehran, and then I'll see if we have one last question from the floor. So my question is kind of that about the convergence, the overlap between the internal and the external, essentially. So you talk about the ontology, the confessionary ontology and the non-confessionary ontology, and you basically allocate these to different geographical or geopolitical spaces. So one is, where the ground of Foucault's study, Western countries, and the other one is your specific Iranian case. What I want to ask is that, usually when we observe social phenomenons, we see that, there is not a clear cut between the internal and the external. They influence each other, and, there is a dialectical relationship between them. So what I particularly am interested to know is that in this particular study, especially with the question of confession and the people you talked with, could you see that element of, overlap and the influence of that maybe international, or perhaps, I'm not just going to call it international, maybe the more Western, or, the contexts that Foucault talked about, and that the culture of confession and its effect on, the queer people who are originally from Iran or from the Middle Eastern polities. Could you see did you have any such observance? Because I find that there is an interesting link between you and Zeynab's work, as in Zeynab's interviewees have displayed more of kind of an international, they're more influenced perhaps by international discourses or narratives, and I see that with your interviewees, perhaps that element of the internal, the culture of non-confession, etc., has played an important role in their identity formation. So I kind of wanted to know how you've observed that, and what the details, like a more detailed explanation of that.
Yes,
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. The thing is that, as I said in one of the slides related to the what I can name it as assemblage of sexuality, in that slide I was talking about how they are influencing each other, in one single phenomena called assemblage of sexuality. And in that concept, under that concept, I mean that sometimes you couldn't separate them from each other. The phenomena like gender confirming surgery in Iran or family planning in Iran. If you see in family planning, for example, I mentioned gender confirming surgery as well, but in family planning, they are supposed to incite, under the term that Foucault used, incite people to discourse. I mean, request people to tell the truth of their sexuality, their desire, and etc. It is the framework that usually we know from Foucault, that institutions like psychology incite people to discourse. And family planning is such a plan, actually, because it was supposed to ask the population, because it is a kind of biopower, and as Foucault said, and the government, the state, is supposed to ask this question in an obsessive way, like the Western countries. But at the same time, this is a plan for actually protecting a patriarchal family, which is basically in Iran is a kind of family that is supposed to cover and reluctant to tell the truth of their sexuality to the foreigners, to somebody who is a stranger. So basically, the patriarchal family is based on unconfessing. Lived in an unconfessing context and grown up in this context. But in the family planning, they are supposed to tell their truth of sexuality. So you can see that there are different, different parts, different regime of truth, if you like, in this plan. And actually, it is a paradoxical plan because it was supposed to control the population to more reproduction, as we know. But at the end of the day, you can see that people don't they disobey from the governmental advocacies about more reproduction. That is the result of the material that has been spread within this plan, because since it was started 3 decades ago, you can see that there was some materials, sex education, etc. That was the basis of the knowledge of people, and people just follow that lines, and they don't follow the lines of the government. So you can see that at the same time they are paradoxical phenomena.
Thank you very much for your further elaboration, and thank you both of our speakers for